Awesome. Thank you all for joining us. Today we have myself, Tim Medin. I try to run this place here at Red Siege, and with me the fantastic, wickedly smart Mike Saunders. Mike, say hi. So we're going to be going back and forth here, sort of discussing selecting a C2. Maybe many of you are maybe new to pen testing, red teaming, whatever it might be. So we're going to talk through some of the concerns around this, kind of at a high level. We're going to stay as vendor agnostic as we sort of can. So yeah, let's get rolling with that awesome intro. I said I wasn't going to say in the pre-show thing anything about that cool intro. Every single time, I think it's the coolest thing. By the way, we do stream these live. If you're watching this later, feel free to keep an eye on us on Twitter, the LinkedIn's all over the place. For the next live event, we have pre-show banter, swag at the end. But with that, let's get rolling. There we go. So one of the things we want to do when you're selecting your C2 is understand what is the goal, because the C2 selection is very much going to differ depending on what you're trying to do. And that seems pretty straightforward, but it's always important to think about this first, right? Like imagine you're trying to fix your car. You don't just grab any tool. Like, hey, let me grab this screwdriver. Like, well, I mean, you're changing a tire. You could probably use enough screwdrivers and make it happen, but you need to understand what we're trying to accomplish here. Are we going for testing the defenders, the defenses? Are we going low and slow? Is evasion important? And we're going to discuss each of these as part of selecting a C2 here in just a little bit. Some of the other very common questions, actually one of the first questions you need to understand is, what kind of test are you doing? Is this your traditional internal pen test? You're going to have some different needs, significantly so, than a red team, where you're going to be much more low and slow, much more stealthy. Also, if you're doing a purple team, you're going to have very different tools. I kind of lump it in with C2 because, I mean, it kind of is in a way, but tools like Atomic Red Team, Scythe for some of the purple team, where you're testing the tactics, techniques, and procedures of a specific adversary or maybe a type of adversary. So with our traditional pen test, we're going to go pretty fast. We want to be loud and proud. And with our traditional pen test, we're going to spend a lot more time maybe exploiting, a lot more time scanning. These are going to be features that are going to be much more important in some of our tools, including some of our C2. For example here, Metasploit is the biggest and most well-known tool here by far. It's got a lot of capabilities for exploitation, for scanning, for interacting with a lot of different types of remote services. And to be honest, it was designed in a day and an age before the traditional sort of what we think of now as C2 was a thing. It was designed more in an era where we had a persistent TCP connection. We didn't worry as much about slow asynchronous beaconing. And frankly, in those days, there was a lot more really crappy software. Now we just have regular crappy software. That was like supersized crappy software. So we had a lot more exploits. I mean, I started cutting my teeth a number of years ago with good old MS 08067. A nice SMB flaw in Windows, very reliable, gets you system level access on, at the time, any of the Windows systems. But of course, times have changed, and the needs for us as testers has changed as well. Some of the bigger focuses we have these days, and this is what we're going to be spending our most time discussing here, is around red teaming. When we get into red teaming, maybe an assumed breach with red teaming, a lot more focus is on post-exploitation. And we're going to see that the tools that we use here, the C2, the other tooling, it doesn't have that exploitation focus like we saw with Metasploit, kind of an earlier generation, grandfather, if you will, to a lot of these tools. Didn't have the exploitation features in these modern tools. Metasploit, again, much more designed for scanning, for interacting with these services at a much broader level than just command and control and some lateral movement. With our red team, we're going to spend a lot more a lot more focus on asynchronous communication. Now, we don't have time to go into test design for a red team and different tiers of C2, command and control, right? So with something like that, we're going to have maybe our long haul that will check in once a day, or for a really long assignment, once every few days, once a week. Tier 2 is going to be a little bit faster, could be every 4 hours, 8 hours, day, etc. But the important piece here with the red team is we do need this feature. We very much need this feature to have these beacons, agents, grunts, whatever we call it, these implants that are running on the remote system. It's really important to have them do a thing, or get some information, send information, get a task, and then go to sleep till we need them. We want them to be much quieter. Right? If they're a persistent TCP connection out to the internet, that's going to stand out a lot more if you've got any sort of network monitoring systems. If you're analyzing flow data, right? A persistent TCP connection to the internet, not that common these days. Of course, we see some of that with web. But we're going to talk about some of the different channels we've got available for us in C2 here in just a little bit. I spoke about this just a second ago, but we've got our purple team. With our purple team, the goal here is to have very repeatable tests. I'm going to perform this attack, this step, etc., etc., etc. Maybe taken from something like the MITRE ATT&CK framework, where stealth in this case isn't important. In fact, we're trying to see what shows up in the logs. Because what we'd like to do is some sort of maybe scoring. Hey, we ran this particular attack and we didn't see it in any logs. There was no alerting. Or maybe there was an alert, but there's also just a ton of junk alerts. These are the focus much more so on a purple team, where we're focused more on metrics. It's working with the defenders instead of testing the defenders themselves. Some great tools here, and apologies for not including the links, are things like Scythe or the Atomic Red Team. Here we're going to spend much more time on sort of our blue team tools. So we'll leave the traditional pen test behind us. We'll leave the purple team behind us here. Let's talk some more about some of our traditional tools here and some of the features, the pros and the cons. One of the very first decisions you're going to have to make is, do you go paid or unpaid? Now, it's really easy to say, well, of course I want free stuff. The hard part is, if you're using this in a real production test, is since it's free and open source, every single defensive product, every single defensive vendor can get their hands on their tool quite easily, and then adjust their tooling to detect, prevent, respond, whatever, to these tools. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying open source is bad. I love open source. But it's, to some degree, some of these tools can be a victim of their own success. The better that these open source tools become, for something like C2, the more people who are going to use them, including the bad guys. The more bad guys who are using it now means we're going to have the defenders looking at that more and more. So it becomes this problem here. We're like, hey, this C2 is fantastic. Oh, and now we're busted. The paid product, of course, the con here is the cost. And some of these tools are quite expensive. Cobalt Strike, if I remember correctly, I just bought another version, renewed our license, multiple thousands of dollars, I would tell you, but I frankly forgot. To another extreme, things like Nighthawk, $7,000 per seat per year, minimum number of seats. They're expensive. With that, though, you ideally get some kind of support. And to some degree, and as much as I hate this, you're sort of paying to not have it be as easily accessible to the defenders. Not easily accessible to the defensive products, Cobalt Strike, Microsoft Defender, whatever. Of course, they're still going to try to get some of this stuff. They might find it in the wild. And realistically, if it's for pay, maybe the real attackers avoid it because it's harder for them to get. Yeah. So, Mike, do you have any comments so far, especially on this paid, unpaid portion here? By the way, we are a big Cobalt Strike shop. So, go ahead, Mike.
Yeah. No, I think with regard to the pros and cons of something paid versus unpaid, one of the things people are trying to say, Cobalt Strike is dead, and so we got to go to something else. There are so many capabilities for extending Cobalt Strike and obfuscating Cobalt Strike that, yes, off the shelf Cobalt Strike, it's dead. But if you're willing to invest the time, I think that there's so much more that it can do to evade detection. And, we're still working with that. There's still pieces of their toolkit that I haven't implemented in our daily processes yet because it's just trying to get up to speed on them. I did see a question here. I'm going to take a look at it now so I don't forget about it. Nathaniel's asking any viability with persistence through habit. And there certainly are some options there. You have things like malicious Office add-ins that you can use. So when they open that Office product, no matter what sheet they open, that add-in runs, and that can give you some persistence. And we've seen some articles in the past about like Outlook were some big ones there. The other option would be taking that default spreadsheet that is part of your profile and embedding a payload in that. That would certainly be an option.
Yeah, and to Mike's point with the Cobalt Strike being dead, Mike is our resident expert on making CrowdStrike cry, getting Cobalt Strike to run. And he spent a bunch of times in the artifact kit, the beacon object files, some of the other pieces. And it's so malleable. It does take a lot of time, right? It takes a lot of time. And that tool, as much as I hate to say it, it sort of weirdly crosses the line here between the paid and unpaid. Yes, it's paid, but I'm kind of lumping in with the free because there's just a lot of free copies that have leaked for whatever reason. So it has these sort of negatives of both to some degree, where it's out there and the bad guys using it like crazy, honestly, because it is so good. So yeah, I mean it's good stuff. And to Mike's point before, we've had a lot of discussions like at what point do we if we have to kill Cobalt Strike, but then figure out some other ways. There's a lot of research out there. Unfortunately, some of that is kind of going to ground because you talk about it like, hey, here's this cool new technique. Awesome. It's dead in a couple of days. Yeah. It's free if you know where to look. Yeah. Yeah, true. I guess if everything is. Yeah. Kevin, our resident shady person. By the way, Nathaniel, nice to see you. Cool. What are some of the features that we're going to need here, right? We work in a team. Mike, myself, Corey, and a number of other folks here. We're working together on this. So one person gets access. We need the ability to hand off. Now, some of the C2 doesn't do this. I mean, Metasploit, there are ways to make it do that. The Metasploit Pro does a much better job of it. But traditionally, this wasn't a feature. And there's going to be a lot of C2 out here where it'll give you other capabilities, but then doesn't have the multiplayer aspects, right? I mean, and our test, Mike, you could probably answer more on this. We've sometimes, especially on the red teams, we have two people working together on this. And if we didn't have this multiplayer aspect, we'd be screwed, right?
Yeah, 100%. It's having that multiplayer capability is almost essential. I can't see the viability of any C2 used in a team environment that's not multiplayer, unless maybe you're talking about like stage 0, right? Like maybe your stage 0, your initial dropper that's on the box, maybe you could have that non-multiplayer, but everything beyond that, I think you pretty much have to have multiplayer these days to really be a viable competitor.
Yeah, and Mike's setting the stage here, no pun intended. But a lot of these C2 frameworks, they don't have the capability, like we talked about with Metasploit, to exploit that initial system. And we have to spend these days a lot of time trying to get these things to load into memory. You'll hear that referred to as stage 0 at some point. Depends where you're counting from, whether it's stage 1 or stage 0. Cool. I saw a question pop up there, Jake on. Oh, did it go away? Was it just a comment? Oh, thank you, Artistic Girly, who helped us with the lock picks. Fantastic. And we'll talk through some of these other features here on this particular page here, this slide, the different types of comms that we want, some of the other features that we need. The operating system support. I mean, these days, realistically, if you put the slide back up real quick, Jake on, what operating system do you need? Well, this is talk to your target. Now, to some degree, people are like, well, I need all the operating systems. Well, one of the trade-offs you're going to have to make sometimes is I want feature X and I want feature Y and feature Z, but you can get 2 out of those 3. And you're like, which do I get? Do I get Mac support, but now I can't tunnel over some weird protocol? And of course, there's the GUI versus CLI. And even with the GUI tools, there's still a CLI aspect to it. The GUI is kind of nice, but sometimes you get lost in the GUI. The CLI typically has a little bit more difficult learning curve. So even though it looks like it's easy because there's a GUI, there's a lot of little commands you've got to remember. I mean, Mike, we're talking about this all the time with folks on the team who are maybe newer to Cobalt Strike on like, hey, here's a series of the commands that are different than what you remember, right?
Sorry, don't know how to work the chat. Yep, absolutely. Remembering those commands between them, and if you're working with multiple C2s, the way they do things can definitely be a little bit problematic. I think, Jake, if you can throw that slide back up there again, because I'm totally missing something there. Oh yeah, OS target victim support. I think that from OS side, like for me, having something that works in Windows is probably the biggest, combining that with a SOX proxy support. If I can proxy through my beacon, most other OSs are going to be SSH at that point, and I can very easily handle that. So the biggest thing that I've run into or that I'm concerned about is Windows, just for me. Although I do talk to some testers that are like, oh, we almost never work in a Windows environment. We're in Linux all the time, and I'd be interested in to test doing some type of environments that were purely Linux to really test that theory. But for me, SSH does the trick.
Yeah, very cool. Related to some of that too, what C2 mechanisms do we use? We see, I mean, the web, the internet these days is HTTP, HTTPS, right? So it's nice from a command and control perspective to use that because you're going to blend in. Well, we've got multiple iterations of HTTP, HTTP2, HTTP3, right? And can we use some of those? Now, this is a little bit more difficult because finding some of the support, for example, with the C2 frameworks, using something like HTTP3 is pretty rare. In fact, if I remember correctly, there's only like 1 or 2 that support it, but they aren't quite as stable. They don't have some of the other features. So this is going to be some of the trade-offs that you're going to have to make when you select some of this. We've got all these other protocols too. Again, what is the goal that you're trying to test here? Are you trying to test, hey, can I get out on protocol A, B, C, and D? Are you trying to test a web proxy that might be monitoring you and saying, hey, look, you've got good visibility into HTTP, HTTP2, but nothing with 3, right? So we see sometimes some protocols are ignored. So for example, DNS. DNS is this weird binary sort of a situation where either is the quietest thing on the network or the loudest thing on the network. I mean, it's very, very loud. It all depends on monitoring and alerting. Mike, any comments on that?
Yeah, 100%. DNS, it's either, like you said, is binary, because if you're not looking at DNS, it is a great channel to hide in. However, if there's any inspection happening at all at the DNS section using DNS C2 for anything other than long haul, like if you're doing that for your long haul where it checks in once every 12 hours for a task, great. If you're doing any kind of operational thing over DNS, if anyone at all is paying attention in those logs, it's screaming, "Hey, look at me! I'm not supposed to be here." So that's definitely we use it, but we try to avoid it, because even more products, you think like Microsoft Sentinel, Cisco Umbrella, their Open DNS. Even I believe CrowdStrike even is doing some DNS type inspection now. So there are more and more things that are doing DNS inspection automatically, that it's, you like to think that you're going to get out with it like, hey, no one's looking at it. And if you'd asked me 2 years ago, is anyone looking at DNS, I would have said, nah.
Yeah.
Like, no, that'd be perfect. But now I'm surprisingly getting a lot of visibility on that. I think the other thing about channels, yeah, we can speak out over HTTPS, but what about applications that are using HTTPS as a transport? So if you think about some of them, whether you're using C3 with Cobalt Strike or some other method, hey, we're doing our C2 comms through Pastebin, or we're doing it through Slack, or we're doing it through GChat, something like that. When there are these services that you're going to services that are already allowed, can you detect that odd pattern of traffic within a service that you already are allowing?
Yeah, that's a great point too, because there's like the C3 stuff for like OneDrive. If you're a Microsoft shop, you're using OneDrive. Cool. If I'm blending in there, like how do you find that? Because it's not like you're going to block it. So it's yes, it's secured encrypted communications. Maybe you're cracking that open, but then you're kind of stuck with other stuff that you're probably not going to be able to read, and definitely not block. So very cool. Good point. The loading piece. Now, this is one of Mike's specialties. I am not great at this. Mike Saunders here, Corey Overstreet also on the team. I can't. He's actually on site doing a red team, trying to break into buildings with Jason, lovely little Jason. And I realized I should have put stage 1, whatever. But these C2 tools, again, they don't have, they used to out of the box. I remember when Cobalt Strike relatively early on, before it really started being used by bad guys, and frankly, before the defensive products really started catching it, you could generate a payload from the tool and it would work fine. These days, there's no quicker way to get caught than try to generate the payload straight from the tool, because you will get caught almost immediately. There were other tools like Veil, similar tools that would take shellcode. Maybe we'd take it from Metasploit, Cobalt Strike, fill in the blank other tool, and then wrap it. But we're seeing here the wrappers themselves are getting caught. It's like, hey, that's weird. Why are you using py2exe, py installer, or whatever to generate an executable? Because that's not normal. Mike, if you wouldn't mind, you're much bigger and frankly way better at the loading piece than I am. You want to talk about that for a moment?
Yeah, sure. And some of this is going to bleed into the next spot too, where we're talking about evasion. But you know, when you're thinking about the loading, and Tim made reference to like stage 0 or stage 1, and stage 1, stage 2. It just depends on whether you're numbering from 0. In many places, you'll have like many teams will use just a small stage 0 or stage 1, which is this little piece of code that has a little bit of capability. What OS am I on? What's the host name? What's the IP? And then allow it to do something like download and execute a payload. And so it's not a full C2. It's literally just a small little command shell that you have running on an endpoint. And then you need to get your fully featured C2 running in memory, whether that's Cobalt Strike or Merlin or Covenant or whatever it is. Most places, the stock thing isn't going to work these days, just because of the way the AV and EDR industry is working these days. Like they're looking at all the tools, and every time an update is published, they're developing a signature for it. So some things like, boy, I'm forgetting the name of it right now. I wish I could remember. Scarecrow. Scarecrow worked really good, and then it wasn't working for a long time. At least for me, I didn't have much luck with it. And then recently they published a new version. All of a sudden Scarecrow's working again. But I feel like that has a very short half-life before it gets signatured. Same with any other kind of public loader that's out there. MS Build. If you do MS Build, the typical template that people use is the 3G student template. That is signatured, but it just requires a little bit of tweaking, and you can still use MS Build today. Like I use that all the time, but I also do custom shellcode loaders, whether they're written in C# or C, and using various means and methods for doing that obfuscation, whether it's something like syswhispers, inline assembly, or just using some string obfuscation, maybe encrypting certain strings in memory and not decrypting them until you need them, doing call by reference rather than calling, create thread, call the address to create thread if you're doing it in C, or using delegates in C#. They're writing a custom loader is almost essential these days. I can't think of the last time I saw on a test that an EDR or AV where an off-the-shelf custom or off-the-shelf stock loader would work. I just haven't seen that. I think there's some more to add in the evasion slide when we get there.
Yeah, and that's a great point too, because it's almost that the difficulty, and again, we'll jump into evasion in just a second, that the hard part with the evasion is that initial loader, getting that thing to load. Mike referenced the MS Build. What that technique does is it bounces off of a signed Microsoft executable that's used by .NET to run code of our choosing, our shell code, Cobalt Strike, whatever it might be. So those are nice ways with the app control bypasses, the trampoline off of Microsoft, but that can be quite difficult. So as Mike sort of mentioned here, it used to be that the AV and the evasion was really easy. I remember back in the day, I was a Metasploit guy, and this brand new evasion came out called Shikataganai, which, so I've been told, is Japanese for nothing can be done about it. Well, if you use that payload, you're dead in the water. It takes a lot of time now and a lot of dedicated time to get past this. In fact, we've got Mike and Corey and my team here helping out with some of this. We've got some external resources coming out with some, frankly, awesome loaders with some really interesting ways to bounce off of known good software to execute arbitrary code and hide and things like that. Again, Mike is the expert here on the evasion, so I will hand it over to him as quickly as I can.
Yeah, absolutely. So from the evasion side, there's multiple pieces to it too. You think of the traditional AV side, is a file safe or not? We're running into things where most of the time you're going to have your shellcode encrypted, because the first 8 bytes of any shellcode loader are basically going to be the same. I don't remember the sequence now, but it's always going to be the same, essentially your PE header. Those bytes are always going to be there. So if that shows up in some file, most AVs and EDRs are like, nope, not going to allow this to happen. So you have it encrypted, which means you've got higher entropy. So some things are looking at higher entropy and going, I'm not going to allow that to run. Like it's not even either not going to allow it to hit disk, or if it hits disk, it's going to look at it and say, I'm not even going to try to execute this. Let's say you get past that hurdle. Now you have to get that, you need to allocate memory, you need to get the shellcode into memory, you need to execute it. It's a well-known pattern, usually something like virtual alloc or heap create, heap alloc, and then copy code in, and then something like create remote thread or something like that. Those execution patterns are well-known, and they happen usually very quickly. And so now you're coming into the space where we need to obfuscate our obfuscation. So if we're using encryption, we need to find a way to hide the fact that we're using encryption from the AV and EDR. Built using things like sandbox detection to see, are we running in a sandbox, whether that's an analyst sandbox or an automatic execution sandbox that's part of your EDR suite. And then using timing-based delays, because lots of them are looking for that memory allocation, copying into memory and execution within a short period of time. So now maybe we're building in delays. But we can't use sleep because lots of AV and EDR are hooking the sleep function, so they're just going to jump over it. So we need to use something else to cause our processor to take a long time that does effectively the same thing as actually sleeping. So it's a constantly evolving game. I had a perfectly working shellcode loader written in C, and then I went on vacation. And like it worked on Friday, I went on vacation and I came back on Monday a week later, and now it doesn't work. Like, and I haven't figured that out. Like, why? Nothing. I changed nothing, but now Defender's like, no, I don't like you. And that can happen, you know, multiple times I've had where I had a working payload on Friday, like, okay, we get everything ready for the test next week. And then Monday morning, better do one more check, and something's changed, something's been signatured. And so yeah, definitely definitely a constant battle. Nathaniel asked normal mathematical questions for fluff. Like, yeah, throwing in some junk code, and you'll see some tool sets will actually do that. They'll just build in junk functions that run but don't do anything. They're not useful to the program. That one, cause delays, and two, make it look more like legitimate code. And so maybe we allocate some space in a buffer, but then we go out and do a bunch of other things, and then we come back and execute our buffer. That's a little less suspicious than, hey, I created memory, copied code into it, and executed. There was another question. There we go. Yeah, Sector 7 stuff. Absolutely. I'm currently going through the second piece of the Sector 7. So basically the intermediate one. I did the intro and doing the intermediate one. Looking for what's next after that. Both of those have been really good. I've learned a lot of valuable techniques that I use on every test from those two courses. So yeah, those are definitely great courses. Going to have a blog coming out sometime soon that I believe has links to some more resources in it for you. So keep an eye on the Red Siege Twitter or LinkedIn, and you will see that blog coming out, and that will hopefully have some resources for you in there as well.
Yeah, very good. Yeah, I remember one of the times Mike was frustrated trying to get one of the C2s work, and he literally just duct taped the English dictionary to the end of it, and it's like, fair enough, because it was the lamest, dumbest check. I was like, is this too random? Yes, cool. Duct tape the English dictionary. Fair enough. It worked. I was like, I was laughing my butt off. I was like, how the hell is this is this working?
True story.
Yeah.
True story. Like the stupid human tricks, this will never work. And yet then I tweeted about it, and turns out that's, my most popular tweet to date is like, hey, here's this stupid thing I learned, and people were like, mind blown. You'll never know if it works until you try it. And the crazy thing is, some really stupid things work to get around AV and EDR.
Yeah. Yeah, and I just put the slide up real quick, Jaycon. I think we covered the most of these things already, but sometimes it's literally just replacing the functions. Like virtual protect rather, it allows you to change permissions on memory region, very commonly used by antivirus, signatured by that. So instead, you have to use multiple other functions to accomplish the same task, and swap some of those pieces out. And then some of the capabilities in like Cobalt Strike C2 allow you to more easily swap this out. If you're doing your own, of course, that's going to take a lot more time manually to do that. But I think the rest of those we covered, right? Looking at
There's
the
a
list.
couple of pieces
Okay.
there on the end. Think about that typical fork and run versus inline execution. Fork and run means if you want to run a post exploitation job, like, hey, I want to run Bloodhound, or rather Sharphound. Um, are you going to create a new process, meaning fork a new process, inject into it, and run your code from there? Or are you going to run it from within your inside beacon? That's a design decision that you need to make, because they have different patterns. They look differently. They've got different OPSEC implications. Some C2s support fork and run only. Some will do that, or you can now add inline execute. Things like X-Force Red has inline execute assembly that can be used with Cobalt Strike, and now everything's running in your beacon, and you're not creating another process. Same thing with those kind of post-exploitation jobs. Some things can be done through the Windows API, and that is a lot less noisy than injecting some assembly into memory, whether it's in your process or another process, and then executing it. And that's where those BOFs, those beacon object files, come into place. It started with Cobalt Strike. However, more and more C2s are starting to adopt that capability of taking a BOF, whether it works in Cobalt Strike or Nighthawk or another one, and use that to do certain jobs. And the benefit of that is because you're not injecting an assembly into memory and executing it, whether it's in another process or in your own. There are certain signatures associated with that EDRs are looking for, versus doing it with native APIs. And then you can possibly bypass some detections that way. So whether or not you want to use BOFs is something that you would definitely want to think about, because that's going to inform your C2 decision.
Yeah, and when you're doing this, it takes a lot of time, right? And one of the things that you have to have as part of this is you need your own lab. And there's two pieces. There's one, how does the tool work, right? Like literally understanding how to drive the car. And then the other course is making your car look like a deer, right? The evasion piece and the tooling available. So you need some monitoring software, whatever that might be. When you're running your payloads, what does this look like? If you want to go super red, you need to understand some of the artifacts that you're leaving behind when you run your payload. When you take this specific action and look for other systems or to perform lateral movement, what kind of logs are you leaving behind? Are those commonly alerted? Are they alerted in this environment? Because those are going to be some very important discussions. And Mike mentioned it before. Mac, Linux, Windows is going to be pretty much a no-brainer. You have to have some of the. My camera decided to blink. Windows is going to be pretty much a no-brainer. Do you need Mac or Linux? Mike, did you have any comments on this? I know you wrote portions of this.
Mainly just on that monitoring side, and more from a Windows perspective. But there are things like Detection Lab that can give you an automated analysis environment. There are some others out there designed to build a lab that you can test in, but Detection Lab comes with most of the tools. Something like Sysmon. I don't know if you need to go full Swift on security Sysmon config, but that would push you in the right direction for seeing all the things that your C2 implant is doing on an endpoint. But definitely, the more visibility you can get into what's happening, the better. Especially if you can add in some network-based resources there as well, so you can see what it looks like on the wire. Even if you're not looking at the actual requests, looking at the volume of requests. For instance, something that's doing a persistent channel versus something that only beacons every once in a while.
Yeah, and there's sort of two pieces here. If you're trying to get better at the C2 piece, I mean, this piece here is how does the tool work? What does the action on target look like, right? And this piece, the other part of the lab here, and frankly, an additional skill set, a little bit different, if you pull the slide up, is you need a lab infrastructure if you want to develop this skill, right? If you want to do leg day, you're going to have AV tools. Now, Defender is getting really, really good. In fact, Defender ATP is one of the most difficult ones to get by these days. Much easier to come by than calling up CrowdStrike and say, hey, can we get a copy? So look at that. Look at some of the information extracted by tools like Velociraptor. Again, so a lot of these tools are free with air quotes, right? You got to pay for Windows, but it's available and more easy to test than some of the other tools. And it helps you practice and hone some of those skills before you actually have to do it necessarily under fire with a for paid tool. Mike, do you have any comments here?
Not a lot. Just wanted to say, mainly if I can get a payload past Defender, it's going to work against most other AVs and EDRs from just an initial static detection capabilities. Can I get it on disk without it firing off an alert? May not have the same level of capabilities from an EDR perspective, meaning once it's executing. And that's where understanding what it's doing some analysis, and another shout out to Sector 7. If you go through the Sector 7 training, they take you through some analysis of your payloads, how to debug that, and use a few different tools to take a look at it so that you can see what it's actually doing in memory, that may help you in your evasion game.
Yeah, it's a relatively, the price on that, we keep talking about that Sector 7 training. It's I think it's what, 600 US or something like that?
Less than that. It's about, I would say average about 300 to 350 a course.
That's right, because I think that's right, because a couple of guys bought both and it was $6 something. That's right.
Yeah, and they've been having a lot of specials where you can get it for 15, 20% off. I think I got like 3 of the courses, like the Windows Persistence and the 2 other ones for about $750.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Pretty affordable there. And then, of course, the final piece of the lab is you need the system to run your C2 on. This is, it's sort of an obvious piece, but sometimes getting these frameworks set up can be a little bit of a pain with some of the dependencies. If you want to try out a number of them, you can grab for example, SANS Slingshot C2 Matrix Edition. Long words there, but it comes pre-installed with a number of different C2 frameworks. Now, I don't recall how often those are necessarily updated, but you can get a feel for those and see which ones are going to work the best for you. And you'll see here on the slide, Apfel Covenant, Empire Faction, Kodiak, Merlin, Metasploit, Silent Trinity, and Sliver. The big ones that I see used these days are Sliver, Covenant, some Empire. Empire is one of those interesting ones where either it is perfect in their environment or it's the worst. It all depends on, are they doing something to monitor or prevent PowerShell? If they aren't, Empire is a fantastic option these days. If they are restricting it and monitoring it, it's a terrible option. So there's really no in between with tools like that. So I highly recommend grabbing a VM like that. If you want to go through the setup process yourself, you can save yourself a little bit of trouble here, where you can quickly try out a couple of these with your labs. Quick reference here, quick shout out. George Achiles does a number of different talks about the C2 matrix and things like that. I just want to quickly pull this up. We don't have time to go through all of the, especially demo, all of the various C2 frameworks, but the C2 matrix here, freely available. A number of fine folks and me, I'm not part of the fine group, have put some effort here to help define the matrix. So there's a couple different options. One is to ask the matrix here, and you can see the list of the C2s it knows about and say, hey, do you need multiple users? And you'll see as I click this button, it then filters down. It removes the ones that aren't multiplayer. And if I say I need HTTP 3 here, you say, look, there is no HTTP 3 and multiplayer. So this is where you might have to make a trade-off and say, okay, maybe I want 2. Well, maybe not 2. DNS, right? So it narrows itself down. Now, you might get over-constrained. The option that I think that's a neat sort of a walkthrough to go through, but if you want to look at the matrix itself, It's just simply a Google Doc. And so you'll see all of the different C2 channels here off to the side. So you can look through this and make decisions that way as well. And you can see here, I think there's 103, if I remember correctly. Yeah, 103 with two lines at the top. 102. Sorry, it's off by one. Right? There's a ton of different C2 out here. Now, some of these are definitely not prime time ready. Somebody wrote it. It works. Now, the nice thing with that is it might fly past every single AV EDR because no one's looking at it, but it might not give you the reliable connection that you might need on the network. So, highly recommend you check out that particular link. And with that, we are going to open it up to some questions. Don't forget, check us out here, Discord. Hit us up on email, the tweeters, whatever. So, question here. Everyday Research released a novel C2. How is important the idea of certified exploit implants? Does that impact the choice of C2 with clients? Do you get product S is verboten? The only thing I've ever heard for preventing a product is, and this has been a long time, is a number of years ago we had a client who said you can't use open source tools, which I thought was weird, but I think they just, if something went sideways, they wanted somebody to sue. Certified exploits, I mean, I haven't really heard of that. Mike, do you have any thoughts on that?
No, and the question we got earlier that JCon sent us is they're certified exploits implants marketed by Core Impact, and I think they're marketed as being like certified for being, stable. I don't remember, but honestly, we haven't had anyone really tell us you have to use this or you can't use this. The idea of certified exploits, no one has asked us really about that from tests, from a test perspective. We haven't had a client that said, oh, you need to have something that's got some kind of certification associated with it.
And to Mike's point, these days, the number of times we're using exploits, very small. I mean, it's passwords these days. It's using built-in features. It's misconfigurations. The number of reliable exploits out there these days, they're short-lived. They're not reliable, so that means we might crash the service. We might crash the system. So the number of those is a little bit low. The closest thing we have to a certification is when a client says, you have to use such and such encryption inside our environment. We're like, okay, cool. Our C2 uses that.
Yeah, and that idea of exploits is only for some definition of exploit too. Like some people say, oh, you did some of the ADCS stuff, that's an exploit. Well, not really. That's an abuse. Like when we're saying exploitation, we're talking like MS-08, 067 or 1710. I can't recall the last time I used one of those on an assumed breach test. We've certainly done them on some internal network pen tests.
Yeah.
That's still where they're appropriate. But from an assumed breach standpoint, maybe last summer I did one. This client asked about testing some of the potato stuff, like rotten potato, juicy potato. But other than that, I can't think of a time I used it.
Yep.
For any number of reasons. There's a lot of reasons I wouldn't use one. Molly sent us a question too. Someone earlier asked about exfiltration, and I don't remember if we were thinking about possibly doing that.
Nathaniel asked that. He's like, are we going to do a talk in the future about exfiltration? This is a hard spot for us as testers because what I don't want to ever do is take the real client data out of the organization. Because if I take real credit card information out of the organization, and it's on my computer, I am now part of their PCI network, which means I fall under their destruction, the reporting policies, all sorts of things like that. So we do our best. In fact, we have policies around this to prevent, hey, don't grab this stuff. If you do, here's the policy to clean up afterwards. The only thing we do keep intentionally, other than maybe a redacted screenshot, would be anything that's useful in a pen test. So, right, passwords, password hashes, SSH keys. The cryptography keys probably not going to be useful, so I don't want those. So the exfil is hard. What we'll do related to that, like we've got, for example, like a ransomware type of assessment, is we generate fake files and exfiltrate the fake files. The important piece here isn't the contents. The counterpoint I hear then is, well, but I want the real data to see if my EDR hits it. Well, the I can obfuscate that. Literally a simple XOR, a simple changing of a couple of bits, and then you no longer see any of that. So I think that's a little bit misguided there. But yeah, the exfil thing is just tough because the risk is just simply too high. That's not something that we're willing to do. It's just simply too risky.
Yeah, it basically take enough to need to prove your point and then be done with it. Try to like when I try to view files, I try to do on the client side as often as possible, so I'm not gathering that data.
Right, question here: we'd love to
yeah.
hear how you folks handle infrastructure if you're open to it. We use DigitalOcean as our preferred option. We build the systems here. We've got a template. I'll let Mike talk about some of the redirectors and such.
Yeah. So how far you build out the infrastructure depends on what you're trying to do. If a client knows you're doing the test, they're not going to try to be actively catching you. You need a lot less deception, so it can make your infrastructure simpler. In those cases, we may just go directly between a droplet and the client and open up a firewall role, if they'll allow that. If we're trying to be a little more hidden, we definitely don't go straight to the team server. We may use redirectors. One thing that we do like to use is route through legitimate infrastructure, whether that's a AWS CloudFront instance or Fastly or Azure CDN. CDNs are a great way for routing your traffic over something that's already going to be allowed almost 100% of the time in your client environment. And I'm not talking about fronting, because that is different. In fronting, the host name that you're requesting is different than the SNI and the certificate, and then that allows you to basically route through the infrastructure by first requesting a host name that might be allowed in your client's environment. We're not talking about that. This would be that the host name matches the certificate name, but it's just, for instance, xyz.cloudfront.net maps back to your team server over here. And so you're just requesting xyz.cloudfront.net and it forwards it directly to your team server. Sometimes you can use a redirector in there to help protect your team server so that you don't get requests that you don't want to your team server. Maybe you're trying to throw off the blue team. They may try to pull it up and grab it. And if they go to that CloudFront address, they're going to get redirected to your team server. But maybe you say you also have to include this specific header in the request or a non-standard user agent. Like you copy the standard user agent and just change one bit of it. And if that user agent isn't exact, your redirector kicks that to another place. We can definitely use those, but we don't use them a lot because we're not typically trying to evade at that level. But if I'm doing more of a red team type of assessment where I absolutely do not want the blue team to ever get wind of my infrastructure, then we're definitely using some kind of redirector. And how that's configured really depends on what C2 is behind the redirector. But in those cases, I would still probably route it through something like CloudFront or Fastly before it got to my redirector. We may buy custom domains, but the problem with buying custom domains is you have to get them classified. You have to care and feed them. It's not something you can do right before the test most of the time. So it's something that needs to be done well in advance. And it really depends on what proxy and AV EDR they're using, what classification that has. And sometimes it's hard to know that ahead of time.
Yeah, there's kind of a long play with some of that too. Like we've got some shepherding systems that are they've literally been cooking for a year, and I think everyone kind of forgot about them. You may have already talked about it, but want to know if there's any resource or course you recommend for AV evasion. I don't know off the top of my head. The problem is it changes so quickly. Any sort of detailed technical piece, tactical rather, whatever, changes very quickly. So you kind of take a higher level. Mike, I think you've taken a couple that you might be able to recommend something.
Definitely, again, the Sector 7
Yeah,
stuff,
that's what I
the Sector 7 intro and intermediate malware development courses teach a lot of great concepts. I did a blog a couple of years ago, maybe a year or two ago, I don't remember when it was, about basically getting Mimikatz working against Windows Defender and the kind of things that you need to do there. There's so much happening out on Twitter. I try to tweet. I see these AV, Evasion, and EDR things happening all the time. I'll try to make sure I'm writing myself a note. If you guys watch the Twitter, I will try to put together some links and tweet that out in the very near future for you.
So does a target play a role in help deciding the channels as HTTPS looks? So I think there's actually two pieces here. The comms channel, that depends a little bit on the test design. So for example, if we're doing like a C2 style of assessment, or maybe even a purple team assessment, we want to test a lot of different things to say, hey, we tried X, Y, Z, right? These other things, X worked, Y and Z did not. So we can get some better metrics. We get a little bit with that on the red style test, but typically they just say, hey, just use HTTP. I can't think of another one that's, can you, Mike, where we had a client who said for a red or a red style test where they picked specific protocols?
We've had a couple that said, we want you to test a Slack C2, or we want you to test this type of thing. So in those cases, we used C3 and some other custom stuff. But I think also what Dorian might be asking is, do we use a specific transport method when we pop a workstation versus if we pop a server? And that can absolutely be the case depending on the goals of the test. In a fully informed test where the client knows we're there and we're just trying to more demonstrate the impact rather than helping test evasion and detection, we might say, can we go to the internet directly from the DC? Hopefully not. But if we can, that's something they should know about, because that probably should be reported. But in a more stealthy type of test, I would probably use something like an SMB beacon or a TCP beacon, and have a TCP beacon server listening on, say, a workstation, my initial access workstation, and then throw a TCP beacon on the DC that routes back to my workstation, which calls back out over probably my HTTPS channel, rather than having the server call out, because that may be something that they're looking for. That may be a tell that, hey, we've got a server connecting out to the internet. So definitely might do that if it's a situation where I'm trying to avoid being detected.
Yeah, for those internal Redders type tests, we'll have one or two systems who are, these are the internet talkers, and everything else, it's sort of like an upside down tree. Everyone's going to talk to these systems and they're going to talk out. So if we have access to domain controllers can talk to workstation out to the internet. Because exactly like you said, it's going to look weird. Now, that's a valid test, right? Because if one, you allow it, that's a problem. Two, if you allow it and you're not getting alerts, that's another problem. But relatively early in the test, absolutely not. We would very much route that differently.